Welcome to the AIER's Authors Corners podcast. My name is Ethan Yang. I'll be your host today. And today we will be talking about a new book that the AIER had the privilege of publishing with the Adam Smith Institute, which is another free market think tank in the UK, The Myth of the Entrepreneurial State, which has been authored by two big-time economists, Deirdre McCloskey and Alberto Mingardi. Deirdre is a professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago, teaching economics, history, English, and communication. Alberto is the Director General of the Istituto Bruno Leoni, which is Italy's free market think tank. Deirdre and Alberto, it's great to have you.
Glad to be here.
Wonderful to be here.
I'm only sorry I can't be on the campus.
Oh yeah, it'd definitely be great to have both of you when things open up. But before we start, I'd like to say that this book is it's certainly a great book to read on its own. You know, it's got a timeless message, excellent content. But I think it's even better if you understand the context that led to this book, which you can accomplish by obviously listening to this podcast and maybe reading a little bit more about the intellectual back and forth that we're about to get into. So, Deirdre and Alberto, your book is geared towards refuting the thesis of one intellectual in particular, Mariana Mazzucato. I don't know if I said that correctly. Mazzucato. What is her big idea? And why was it worth writing an entire book about?
Well, you know, I was led into this project, I should say, herded into this project by Alberto, who kept saying, we've got to do a paper on this. We've got to do a paper on this. I said, I got something else to do. No, we got to do a paper. So I'm going to have Alberto answer that question.
Well, you know, Professor Mazzucato is an extremely successful public intellectual, let's put it this way. She wrote a first short monograph on the entrepreneurial state. Then that monograph became a book. The book was widely praised and widely reviewed internationally. The book is really about the idea that industrial policy should not be reviled as it was in some quarters, but actually should be appreciated and seen as the true engine of economic development and in particular innovation. What Mazzucato does in her book is not focusing on cases and examples of countries where you actually add industrial policy, and governments were clearly pursuing industrial policy goals. But she's looking at the US, and she's claiming that some highly innovative, astonishingly innovating features of our life, the internet, the iPhone, all of this is not the result of the private sector. It doesn't come out of private entrepreneurship. But rather, it is the outcome of what she calls directionality, of government planners, basically, that decided that some goals were worth pursuing and pursued them relentlessly, and eventually, these wonderful ideas translated into innovations that were marketed by private companies. But really, private companies did not do that much. It was not entrepreneurship that was driving innovation, but it was the state. Now, this is not a new idea, but she made her case forcefully. She's a very good communicator. Still, we believe she doesn't have much evidence to prove her case. So this book is, by and large, so to say, a reaction to the fact that these theses are tremendously successful within the left, but also within some, clubs of economists and scholars of the right, many of those in the United States under President Trump administration. And, these ideas were taken as if they were proven, as if she had evidence. We think she doesn't, but these ideas are extremely successful because they are basically stories that people like to hear. They give you a sense of the visible end of the state marshaling a country towards a brighter future, which is much easier to understand than, you know, coping with spontaneous order, the market economy, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, yeah. It seems to me that what haunts people is the example of the Manhattan Project in the 1940s, where the state, indeed the state, and secretly, and the military in particular, developed the atomic bomb, and from that, atomic energy. And everyone points back to that. And she's making a new mythology on the basis of, as Alberto says, not very good evidence. For example, she admires the Anglo-French Concorde airplane. Well, this was undoubtedly as Alberto says, government directionality. That's one of her favorite words, directionality. So we're going to have a supersonic passenger airplane. It's going to be beautiful, and it's going to transform transportation. And of course, it didn't. It was a spectacular failure in many ways. It lasted for a long time because both governments, the French and the British, were committed to it. And they've got the power of taxation. They can go on spending on this stuff forever. But it was never a good idea. And she argues often that it's precisely those kinds of projects that the government should be doing. That is, the projects that the private sector won't do. Well, Alberto and I think, you know, kind of in a common sense way, if the private sector doesn't think that an Anglo-French supersonic airplane is a good idea and isn't prepared to put its money behind it, maybe it's a bad idea. I mean, it's just possible that it's. So what we argue, and with lots of evidence, is that this driving is another one of her favorite words. You drive the economy as though it were an automobile, or worse, a flock of sheep, stupid sheep, and you're going to drive them because you're so smart. That this idea, though very popular, unsurprisingly popular with the people who are going to do the driving, the intellectuals, and especially the politicians, is a very poor characterization of how real innovation takes place.
So these ideas actually came up when I was studying in the UK. I remember one of my political science professors really brought up these ideas, like the public sector can be as efficient and as innovative as the private sector. And I was just so taken aback. So can you explain why the public sector cannot be as innovative and as efficient as the private sector? And then what are the general theories that, you know, guide our trust in the private sector? Why should we trust more of society to be driven by private sector interactions versus the public sector?
Well, I'll just give a brief explanation, then hand it over to Alberto for the correct formulation. It's simply that the incentives are all wrong. You know, the deep characteristic of the government, of state, and we're not anarchists, Alberto and I, we think there should be a government, is that it's coercive, right? And after all, taxes are paid on the basis of coercion. Things are done coercively by the government. And that is terribly tempting. Whereas in the private sphere, I mean, it's very easy to get people to do things if you've got a gun that you can aim at them, or a prison term you can threaten them with. Whereas in the private sector, it's intrinsically cooperative, and you have to persuade people. You have to persuade them to buy the product, or to do the development work, or make the investment. And at every stage is persuasive, not coercive. So I think that human societies do a lot better when they're persuasive rather than coercive.
Amen to that. I will just add a couple of things. One is that there are actually many stages in this phenomenon that Deirdre has just described. So we have a tendency in many authors, I mean, some social scientists, lots of layperson, to think that production is easy.
Yeah.
You know, they look at products and so how difficult could be to produce a Barbie doll? How difficult could be to produce a chocolate cookie? Everything looks easy, particularly when you're dealing with products that are perceived as simple. But there are very few simple things, and even if you consider this particular time in history that we are living, so this age of lockdowns and disruption in international trade and freedom to move and exchange on the part of people. Well, one thing that really astonished me is that Italy had a very strict lockdown in the spring. I'm afraid we'll have another in the winter, but I hope not. And for months, lots of economic activities were impossible to be undertaken. They were just closed by fiat. At the very beginning, lots of people ran to the grocery or to the supermarket and bought as much, toilet paper and bread and cornflakes they could. This is typically seen as a form of stupidity, but in some sense it was not. I mean, nobody had a first-hand experience of a pandemic, but people had vague memories of what their fathers and grandfathers told them about the war, about great epidemic, and they associated pandemics and epidemics with scarcity. And so they rushed and buy and they bought stuff. And yet, during these 3 months of lockdown, I remember I was going to the supermarket. Going to the supermarket was kind of an adventure for me. I got so thrilled, as if I was traveling to New York City. I went to the supermarket, and for these 3 months, I always found not only cornflakes with chocolate, but my favorite cornflakes with chocolate every time. So think about how the private sector beautifully adjusted in order to supply products to consumers. And these things are seen as trivial, but clearly a very simple example. Producers of cheesemakers, producers of mozzarella. Well, the kind of mozzarella you produce for pizzerias, for places that they make pizza, is quite different than the kind of mozzarella you produce for supermarket. And these producers, overnight, they were told, pizzerias are all closed. So they are not going to be buying your mozzarella. You need to sell to private individuals at supermarket. And they adjusted. They changed the way in which they make mozzarella and survive and thrived and were able to continuously supply Italians, and I suppose was the same elsewhere, at least in the West, with the products they wanted. All of this may look trivial to somebody, but is tremendously complex. Lots of different decisions need to be taken at different stage between, the cow that makes the milk and the mozzarella that lands on my kitchen table. So, in a sense, I think, these ideas are rooted in a very bad way of looking at the world. The world looks simple, and you're not seeing the nuances. You're not actually enjoying the wonders and the complexity of the world of production and trade and commerce. And that's one thing. And the other thing is that when you get closer to this world of complexity, it really becomes improbable that some ministers in Rome or in Washington, D.C. can see it all.
That's right.
Lots of the relevant decision and lots of the relevant information and basically the relevant knowledge to take production decision is not of the kind that can easily be transferred to people in Rome or Washington, D.C. Once again, there are plenty of examples, but when you go to the supermarket, typically, you never think about the fact that everything that arrives there has been washed at a certain point,
Sure.
in its history. I mean, ham needs to be carefully washed and sanitized and be in the best possible status. But of course, you need to wash ham, and at the very same time, this process of washing it should not allow ham to lose its taste. That would be terrible. Now, there are companies that do exactly this.
Yeah.
And there are other companies that supply machineries that are useful to wash the machineries that the ham company used to wash their ham. And, in the last 30, 40 years, the ham sector moved from washing 8 prosciutti, 8 hams an hour by hand, to something like 300 nowadays with machineries. And these machineries work so well that, you don't sense the difference in taste between, washing a ham with your hand and washing it with a machine. Now, can you really believe that any minister of economic matters in the Western world has ever troubled herself or himself with thinking about washing hams? I don't think so.
That's the basic arrogance of her work and of the idea of planning in general, which is that I know how to wash hams. Oh, do you need to wash hams? Oh, I didn't know that. Well, some sub-minister will take care of that. And the idea that, as Lenin said famously, he was going to turn the Russian economy into one big factory. And that sounds very nice, except that he was going to do it top down. He was going to have the bosses telling the sub-bosses, telling the sub-bosses, telling the workers what to do. And that's not how an economy works. And what makes it worse in her case, and the case of other economists and politicians who like this idea of industrial planning and so forth, and in the industrial policy, is that she wants to apply it to innovation, such as the ham cleaning machine. And if ham was ham and was made with fixed coefficients, so to speak, as we say in economics, which hadn't changed for 200 years, then this top-down planning is slightly plausible. It still involves a tremendous amount of information that the central government in Rome or Washington or London doesn't have. But to apply it to novelties strikes us as crazy, as pazzo, as insane, because the very nature of novelties is that you can't steer them. You can't steer towards them because you don't know. If you already knew, they wouldn't be novelties. The Post-its, those very handy little pieces of paper with glue on the back that temporarily attaches, came from 3M because some engineers, some chemical engineers, were trying to make a glue. And they got this glue that didn't work very well. It was only temporary. It would just hold things very lightly. And they were going to throw it away. And some guy said, no, wait a second. Suppose we put it on little pieces of paper. And, thus Post-its. And it's just unreasonable to, how can I say, subordinate human creativity. Here's one analogy that we use. Suppose someone proposed to you that there be a government office of planned rock music. Would that strike you as a good idea, that some large bureaucracy would be deciding what the next innovation in rock music should be? I mean, obviously it's crazy. And this applies to art and science and lots of other things. That this idea that you can do a Manhattan Project for the whole economy and for everything. I mean, occasionally, in fact, to go one step further with that analogy, the problem is that people have the analogy of war. And in warfare, there's one purpose. And it's very clear what the purpose is. And it's rather obvious that everything, if it's a war of survival, everything about the economy and society and everything else has to be subordinated to defending Mother Russia, for example. And that's fine. That is not fine. I wish it hadn't happened, but it's not applicable to the rest of human goals. We have varied human goals and we have various gifts. And it's just crazy to think that everything's a war or everything's a Manhattan Project to be decided top down. Yet that's what her books and her she is encouraging. Unfortunately, because her father was Italian and she speaks Italian. She, though she was raised in the United States and went to university there, she's now on a committee of the Italian government to lay down the future for the Italian economy. You can see why Alberto was so, I don't know, frantic about us doing something to stop this woman before she writes again.
Now, Deirdre, you actually just answered my last and ultimate question, so I'd like to give a little time for Alberto to answer that question as well. But like you just mentioned, it seems like this idea that the state can be this all-knowing, all-powerful steward of society keeps popping up throughout history, right? We've seen this before. And in particular, intellectuals and love this, right? This is not something that, you know, like normal people or middle-class people are advocating for. This is mainly coming from academia, coming from the bureaucracy. So, Alberto, why do you think there's this almost like this obsession with trying to keep reviving this dream of a very powerful and planning state?
Well, alas, I think it's an idea that also, you know, common people or middle class people, as you said, typically understand and endorse as well, because somehow it's deep rooted in our instinct. I mean, it's consistent with the way that we have been looking at things. You know, whenever we see something, we look for who's responsible, what's the agent behind a phenomenon. I think particularly very bad things, we always need to find a responsible guy. And that works up to a point. I mean, sometimes things happen most of the time. Phenomena are quite complex, and you know, it's very difficult to find one single cause. You know, people want one single cause. You know, you got the financial crisis in 2007, 2008. Okay, it's greed. It's the market. It's big banks. You got COVID. It's China. You know, you just want an enemy, and in some sense, you know, you also want a good guy on a white horse. I mean, all you know, the whole narrative of politics is predicated upon this. You got good guys, bad guys, and if the good guys win, everything is fine. Intellectuals are therefore not particularly different than others, but they add to this general sentiment sometimes a certain degree of frustration. The problem of intellectuals and their rejection of the market economy is a theme that Hayek, Nozick, Ludwig von Mises, Joseph Schumpeter, they all wrote about this. Deirdre did write about this, and the treason of the clerisy, as she calls it. It's a very important phenomenon. It is. I will use the Nozick explanation. Nozick says, intellectuals are people that are very successful in school. So they think that society at large should look like a school and should be rewarding merit, giving grades. But of course, as soon as they finish with school, they realize that society in liberal democracies and free markets, well, society is sometimes rewarding talents that school was not rewarding. So, this sort of income doesn't perfectly resemble grades in your high school. And therefore, intellectuals build this resentment. I always found that quite funny, but also somehow persuasive. I mean, clearly intellectuals tend to believe that the market is wrong most of the time because they pick different criteria from consumers' judgment. They think that some products, some technology, the Concorde airplane or whatever new green energy, they think they are better. They are perhaps better as technologists. They are more advanced, but they are not necessarily better to answer consumers' needs.
Yeah.
And for an intellectual, it's quite difficult to accept that consumers' needs actually may be the most relevant thing in society and not whatever a superior criterion when it comes to technology, science, or aesthetic.
I can't improve on that except to add the coda notice that the intellectual's position, and Mazzucato's in particular, is anti-democratic. It's not about what people want or what they express through markets or even elections. It's what we smart people decide is good for them. And this has been a theme even in liberal societies in the West for a century and a half. Extreme cases, Marxism and communism, but it's also true on the in the 1870s and 80s in Britain. Liberalism shifted to the new liberalism. And according to the new liberalism, just as Alberto says, it's we intellectuals who know what you want.
If I may add to that just one thing, when it comes to industrial policy, I think we should always be clear that the difference is not between those that want private capital to be put at the service of consumers versus those that want government money to be put at the service of consumers. Because, those among us who are fine with using private capital to satisfy consumer needs, well, we accept that, the object is to satisfy consumer needs. Those who want to use government money typically believe they know better than consumers do. So that's the real difference. It's not only a difference in means. It's a profound difference in goals.
Yeah, that's right.
And may I add, this conversation, this debate, and certainly this book is definitely part of a very existential question that dictates the course of history and society. And I guess I'd like to end by the Hayek quote, which really summarizes our position: is that the curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men how little they really know about what they imagine they can design. The Myth of the Entrepreneurial State is available on Amazon, wherever you get your books. And Alberto, Deirdre, thanks for hopping on with us.